Okay, so we have learned all about aperture, both the technical side of aperture, the opening and closing of the lens or the hole in the lens, and then the creative side of that, depth of field. So let's jump now into shutter speed and deal with the technical side of it. We've seen this exposure triangle before, and we understand that these three things make up exposure, or control and allow us to manage or determine how much light is coming into our camera. Remember, in aperture it was the size of the opening in the lens. So now we're going to deal with shutter speed. And shutter speed is the opening and closing of the shutter inside of your camera that will control the amount of light that enters the camera. So you have to imagine that, just imagine that there's a door inside of your camera that's always closed, and it's only going to open when you press the shutter button down. And when you press that shutter button down, it's going to open up a door and light's going to come into the camera. Now, the shutter speed is made up, or it is determined over time. So the longer your shutter stays open, the more light comes in. Okay? Now, shutter speed has a very important relationship that there's another video coming up that you're going to learn all about, but it works together with aperture to control the exposure. Because you got to remember, okay, so we've got a door in our camera that opens and closes and determines how much light comes in. Now, what effect is that going to have if we're using different size apertures? So if we have an aperture of 2, for example, a really big opening, okay, and we leave it open for 5 seconds, how much light is going to come in? And then what's the difference between that and a shutter speed of 5 seconds with an aperture of 22, which is a significantly smaller hole? Obviously there's going to be less light coming in. So we need to know how to kind of balance the light using aperture and shutter speed together. The shutter is located in the body of your digital SLR. This is different than aperture. Remember, aperture is determined by the lens. The shutter is determined, or is located inside of the body of the digital SLR, and the lens has no impact whatsoever on shutter speed, except for very certain situations that we will talk about at a later date. So let's quickly just take a look at the camera and see how the shutter works. Okay, I want to just illustrate to you guys the shutter, and while I don't really have the means right this second to break it down for you guys really slow motion, there's lots of videos on YouTube, and I will include a link on this page, or perhaps even in this video, that will show you slow motion, the shutter actually opening and closing. But let's just take a look at the inside of the camera here. So you can see I've got my camera set to shutter priority, and you can see I've got quite a slow shutter speed. I've got excuse me, 6 seconds here. So what I'm going to do is actually turn my camera and open this up, and you can see inside there's a little tiny mirror. Do you guys see that? Little tiny mirror. And lots of people think that this is actually the shutter. It's not, though. This tiny little mirror, when the light comes into the camera, it's going to hit that mirror and it bounces straight up kind of into this area. There's another little mirror in there that bounces the light one more time into the viewfinder. So this mirror is showing you the preview inside of your viewfinder. Okay, so the light comes in, it hits that, it goes up into the top of the camera. There's another mirror that's angled towards your viewfinder, okay, or towards the eyepiece, and then that is what is allowing you to see the actual image. So you got to just remember that this mirror has nothing to do with the shutter. It's there to give you a preview of what the camera is seeing out of the lens. So what we're going to do here is, let's just make sure I've got this turned on. Ooh. Okay, you could just hear the shutter just fired there, but what's going to happen is when you press the shutter button, okay, the mirror is going to pop up and out of the way so that when the light comes in, it doesn't hit the mirror anymore and up into your eyepiece, but instead it exposes to the sensor. So behind this eyepiece, there's a shutter door that's opening and closing to let the light in based upon how long you have set it. So let's just take a look. Again, this is 6 seconds, but if I press it down, you can now see, hopefully I can turn this so you guys can see it, That little green area in there, that is the sensor. That is what is collecting all of the light information, and that ultimately is what is making your photo. It used to be, again, in film cameras, that little sensor would have been, of course, a piece of film. Okay, now the shutter, which is happening behind this mirror, you can see it if you look really quickly, but the shutter is opening and closing behind this, protecting the sensor and then not allowing too much light to hit it. Okay, so just one more time. Okay, and I don't know if I can get underneath there well enough to show you guys the actual shutter, but again, I'm going to include a video from YouTube on slow motion seeing that shutter moving up and down. Okay, so like I stated before, there's some great videos on YouTube that will show you the shutter in action. So I don't want to include those in here because I'd probably be infringing on somebody's copyright. So all you need to do is head over to YouTube and then search for slow motion shutter. And the very first one that should show up should be a Canon 5D Mark II at 2000 frames per second. And it's a really good example of the shutter opening and closing. So pause this video, take a few moments, head over there and take a quick look. Okay, that's pretty awesome, hey? So the one thing we need to know is with shutter speed is that the unit of measurement is time. Okay, everything is measured and referred to in time. Generally speaking, you're going to be shooting with fractions of a second more than you will be with whole seconds, but there are times and assignments where you will be expected to shoot with whole seconds. Now, what we need to understand is in the eyepiece, on the back of your camera, fractions of a second are displayed as fractions of a second, and whole numbers are displayed with quotations. Okay, we'll get to that in a second. But in the eyepiece, it sounds a little bit confusing, but in the eyepiece, when you're looking at the light meter in the bottom left-hand corner, your fractions of a second are actually displayed as a whole number. So a good example of this would be 1/500th of a second. On the back of your camera, it's going to say 1/500th of a second. But inside of your camera, inside of the viewfinder, it's going to display that as 500. Okay, so there's a little bit of a difference there. Now, whole seconds are displayed with quotations. So a number followed by a quotation mark refers to a whole second. This will be displayed both on the back of your camera as well as inside of the eyepiece, so there's no real difference there. So let's take a real quick look at that. Okay, so we just learned that shutter speed is measured in time, and we need to make sure that we understand how the time is displayed inside of the camera. So when we turn it on, you'll notice that I am in shutter priority mode. Okay, and you'll notice that up in the left-hand corner, that is your shutter speed. We just learned that quotation marks represent full seconds, so this would represent 4 seconds. If I press my shutter button half or all the way, listen for the 4-second shutter speed. Okay, great. Now, if I turn my wheel, you'll notice that I start getting into fractions. Those do represent fractions of a second. So here's 1/200th of a second. Listen for it. It'll be quick. So on and so forth. Now, the only other thing that you need to know is when you look through the viewfinder, and I don't have a screenshot for you, you're not going to see the fraction symbol. So instead, when you look inside here and you see the light meter across the bottom, to the left of that light meter, if you're using this shutter speed as an example, it is displayed as 200, not 1-200. Okay, so if you see a number like 400, you'll know that that represents 1/400th of a second. Inside of the viewfinder or eyepiece, all whole seconds are still displayed with quotation marks, so you don't have to worry about that. Okay, so top left of your camera displays your shutter speed, quotations equal whole seconds, fractions equal fractions of a second. Just remember that fractions of a second are displayed as a whole number inside of the viewfinder. Okay, that's basically it. From a technical standpoint, you just need to understand that the shutter is inside of the body itself. It's a door that opens and closes to determine how much light comes into the camera and is exposed to the sensor. The longer the shutter stays open, the more light comes in, and then vice versa. The shorter distance that the shutter stays open, the The less time that the shutter stays open, the less light comes in. Aperture works with shutter speed together to determine how much light comes in, and like I said before, there will be a separate video on that relationship. And then we just need to understand that the unit of measurement for shutter speed is time, and it is seconds and fractions of a second. Fractions of a second. Yeah, that sounds right. Anyways, it's Saturday. Leave me alone. So, great job. Let's now learn about the creative uses of shutter speed.